I'm going to tell you a little story before I start. Compassion changes you, and you have to be a little careful because one day a lady who was slightly overweight was rushing around and slipped on the stairs and had a concussion. And during this concussion, she had a vision that she went to heaven and saw God. So she said, "That's it, then I'm done, I'm finished." And he said, "Oh, no, you've only had a concussion. You've got 40 years, but I'm afraid you're going to have to be compassionate to yourself, compassionate to mind and body, look after yourself, take care of yourself." And so when she came round from the vision, from the concussion, that's exactly what she did. She was very careful about what she ate. She changed her diet. She was very compassionate to her body. She went to mindfulness and compassion training. And for the last little bit, she had some plastic surgery. Came out of the hospital, walked across the road, was knocked over by the bus. She ended up in heaven and said to God, "God, you told me I had 40 years. And he said, "Oh my goodness, I didn't recognize you." So, compassion changes us. Okay. So let's think about compassion. What I'm going to do is for 20 minutes or so, I'm going to go through a model of compassion and why compassion can be quite tricky. And then my colleague, Yotam, is going to be looking at more details of that. So let's just think about what compassion means, because different people have different definitions, but this is the one we use. Compassion is sensitivity to suffering of self and others with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. And this is important because it identifies two basic psychologies. The first psychology is the ability to turn towards with the intention, the desire, the focus. But the second psychology is the preparedness to take action, and in particular what is called wise action. One of the reasons that some of you are here today is because you want to learn about compassion so you can be, more wise in your compassionate actions. Wanting to be a doctor, that's fantastic. Paying attention to suffering is wonderful. But if you don't put in the efforts to learn to know how to become a medical person, then that's not very helpful. So the compassion must involve both this capacity, this intentionality, this preparedness to turn towards, but also the preparedness to work with and develop the skills to be compassionate. One of the key things about compassion is the ability to see into the causes of suffering. So it's not just about alleviating suffering as we see it, but if we're going to prevent it, we need to understand it. And one of the things that happens when I do that is that we have serious problems with the human brain. And this is a really important story that we would very much push in the compassionate focus therapy. It's important because many of the people that we see have a very deep sense of being unlovable, unworthy, inferior, and bad. They have minds that are full of all kinds of chaotic, aggressive, sexual, and unpleasant fantasies, and they take this all very personally. But the fact of the matter is that we are a gene-built organism. Your brains have evolved in order to do certain things, so they have all kinds of motivations and desires within them. All of us know that we are born, we grow, and then we gradually decay. This is the nature of life. This is the nature of impermanence. No one in this room will unfortunately avoid that fate. And this is part of what is common humanity. This is common to all of us. We also know that we're socially shaped. Not only do we have a body and brain that we never chose and never designed, but our sense of self was not chosen by us either. If I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby, and taken in and brought up in a violent drug gang, this version of Paul Gilbert would not exist. A totally different version of Paul Gilbert would exist, a version that was potentially very violent and quite an unpleasant version. Not only that, but the expressions of my genes would be different because we now know that through a process of methylation, our backgrounds affect gene expression. The point about it all is recognizing that we're all caught up in this reality, the reality of the impermanence of being a biological being that is subject to disease, suffering, and whose sense of self is totally socially created. It's not our fault, but the point is, waking up to this reality means that we have to be able to choose. We have to be able to decide how do we want to be. Because you see, the problem with the human brain is that over about 500 to 700 million years ago, a whole range of motives and emotions have been evolving, and you share many of these with many other animals. In fact, they've been subject to all kinds of laboratory experiments precisely because their brains work very similar to yours. So you, like them, have a capacity for fear, anger, lust, joy, and you, like them, have basic motivational systems for sex, attachment, tribalism, belonging. But you also have evolved a new brain, and this brain is only about 2 million years old. In terms of evolution, it's a rust job. And one of the problems with it is it creates all kinds of feedback loops that can get us into very serious trouble. For example, imagine a zebra running away from a lion. Now, what happens for the zebra is that as they get away and the lion is no longer visible, they can't smell the lion or hear the lion, the arousal will settle down quite quickly. This is based on people like Robert Sapolsky's famous book, Why Zebras Don't Get Horses. But for humans, this doesn't happen, because for humans, we have this new brain, which allows us then to start thinking about dwelling on things, imagining the worst. Can you imagine what would have happened if I had got caught? Can you imagine being eaten alive? Oh my God. What about tomorrow if there are 2 lions? And why the hell did I come to live here anyway? What a ridiculous thing to do. So you have all of this stuff going on in your mind, and this stops you from calming down. But there is a more serious, well, there's a very serious point to that, but there's a serious point to this, which is that a mind that doesn't know itself is potentially a very dangerous and cruel mind. And the Buddha said this over 2,500 years ago: the unenlightened mind is dangerously chaotic. Okay, that's his words. And the reason it's dangerously chaotic is because your brains come with a whole lot of biases. They're biases to focus on yourself. They're biased to focus on your kin. If you have a baby and they in hospital and they take your baby away to weigh it, and they come back an hour later and they say, I'm terribly sorry, we've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that we've lost all the name tags, so we haven't got a clue which baby is yours. But the good news is we've had some wonderful babies born today, and you can come and choose one you fancy. Doesn't work, does it, right? So we're very orientated towards our kin. We're biologically set up to be focused on kin, and we're also very tribal. And the problem with this is that it means that there are, every 10 seconds, a child dies of starvation in the world. Every 10 seconds. Think how many children are going to die today because they haven't got enough to eat. And yet many of us sit down to this very soon. Many children, we know, millions upon millions, live like this, but many others live like that. Why is that? Because we are biologically biased. And one of the things that compassion asks us to do is jump out of our biological determinism, jump out of this biological constraints, to see beyond what our brains hold our attention to. We're also potentially very cruel species. Now, I'm not particularly religious, but this is a dreadful way to die. Why would anybody invent this way to die? Up until 1640, every major city in England had a torture chamber. And if you go to the Tower of London, some of the things that went on there were just extraordinary. Humans are potentially a very nasty species. Make no mistake. And so compassion requires us to see deeply, deeply into the reality of our being. There's also a famous statement this gentleman made, which I think is a meditation statement, is amazing. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And this is part of the Buddhist story as well. Most of us have very little idea into what it is that's driving our emotions and our motives. We just simply act them out. And remember this? This went on for 700 years. In the first 3 months of the opening of the Colosseum, 10,000 people died. They were dying at 1,000 a day. They were having mass battles. And we know that because of tribal violence, we get into this sort of stuff. And this is how we use our intelligence. And unfortunately, not so long ago, the world experienced this. And part of the problem, and Karen was talking this morning, is that we're highly submissive. And this is why it's so wonderful to hear leaders talking in the way that they do. Because in reality, it's the submissiveness that gets us into trouble, because we follow leaders that are destructive. But when you get a good leader, think of Gandhi, think of Nelson Mandela, we also will follow them. What we desperately need in the world is good leaders. Think of what leaders we had at the beginning of the Second World War. In Russia, Stalin. In Germany, Hitler. In Italy, Mussolini. it's extraordinary. If you look at the history of leadership, it's been leaders that have led humanity into all kinds of destructions. Genghis Khan, I mean, they're all there. Good leaders, however, are able to tap into our basic compassion and abilities to be cooperative and find the best in us. And this is a story, of course, that Philip Zimbardo has often taught. So we are a very mixed species. We have the capacity to do terrible things, but we also have the capacity to do wonderful things. We also have capacities in us for love and attachment, to care for our friends, to work for charities and good causes. Medicine is a wonderful profession if you think about it. Caring for others who are diseased and suffering is a wonderful thing to do. No other animal does it as far as we know. Only humans does it. Most animals, most chimpanzees are frightened of their conspecifics who show signs of disease or deformity. So this is important because it means that we have the capacity for being mindful, being aware of what's going on in our brains. And we also have this motivational system which will allow us to organize our minds in all kinds of ways. So compassion then can be defined as this sensitivity to suffering. We do have this basic motivational system. We have other motivational systems that can take control of our mind, but we also have this one. And finally, just to come towards the end of this then, to remind ourselves that compassion is about giving and receiving. And for giving, we need certain competencies, such as capacities for sympathy and empathy. And there are also facilitators and inhibitors for giving. There are things that make it easy for you to give and things that make it more difficult. For example, there are some kinds of compassion that you're very unlikely to see. I care about you, lion. I care about you too, zebra. That's unlikely. If we think about receiving compassion, then that too is there are facilitators and receptors. We find that many of our patients that we work with find it very difficult to be receptive of compassion. We were just talking earlier today with Dr. Rick Hansen about this ability to be open to feel loved and valued. So once again, there are facilitators and inhibitors. We also know that the emotions that can be generated by compassion are not always soft, gentle kindness. Sometimes we're compassionate because we're very angry at injustice. If you see a baby in a burning house and you rush in to save the baby, you're not in a state of calmness. You're in a state of anxiety and panic. You have to save that baby. You might be very frightened, but you override that fear in your effort to be compassionate. And in receiving compassion, we can have an experience of soothing and relief, but sometimes we can also be frightened. So then, to come to the end of my part, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, facilitators and inhibitors involve things like liking. This is why sometimes you have to be a little bit careful with the concept of love, because the strongest compassion, as Karen was saying this morning, is for those you don't like. The strongest compassion, the most healing compassion, the most powerful compassion are for those who are your enemies. If you can have compassion for them and act wisely, then we're in business. Compassion is often associated with a sense of deservedness. Aristotle's view was we only feel compassion for people we feel don't deserve to suffer. Many people that we see in therapy feel they don't deserve compassion. Having the capacity to be empathic and to mentalize, that's important for compassion. Some people who have Asperger's syndromes want to be compassionate, but the ability to actually notice certain social cues is tricky for them. So all of these are aspects which can interfere with or facilitate compassion. So I'm now going to hand over to Yotam, who's going to take you more deeply into the whole area about the fears of compassion.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for creating this marvelous framework that we get to tell you a little bit about. This week has been personal in many different ways, very meaningful ways. It's a joy to be married to Brooke. And I really appreciate how people engage here in this personal way. And I'll do the same by sharing with you why it is that I'm standing here. And I think it has to do something with coming to the United States, California, from Israel in 2005. I don't know if you've been following the news in the last 2,000 years, but it looks like there's a little bit of conflict. And arriving here, not really knowing what I want to do with getting that kind of education, I quickly became really interested in the cycle of violence, trauma, and aggression, wondering not just in the context of Middle East, but really the human species. Why is it that we hurt each other? What are the mechanisms? How can we find a way to interrupt this cycle of violence, of trauma and aggression? And then the answer that emerged is compassion. The question I've been asking for a long time now, how can we increase human resilience, healing, and growth? That is my personal journey of arriving at this path of doing this compassion work. Resilience, how can we help people bounce back once they've been exposed with adversity? How can we find a way to really address the wounded parts of ourselves and arrive at these forms of healing to become more intact, to integrate what has been fragmented? Growth can be defined so many ways. I really liked Mayor Fisher's conceptualization of growth, becoming the best that we could be. I'm here to suggest that becoming more warm, more caring, more compassionate towards each other is a marvelous way to grow, not just on the individual level, also on the collective level. This is an answer that captures quite a bit, I think, in terms of how can we actually augment resilience, healing, growth, reduce suffering, right? The capacity to receive care, to offer care, to be caring towards ourselves. Now the thing is, each and every one of you in your heart of hearts, intuitively, already knows this. And I don't think you came here to hear from a bunch of Dr. Somebody that it's nice to be caring towards yourself and others. We all know this on a deep, deep level when we engage with our own human experience, the experience of others. So really, the question that I want to raise and try to respond to some of these issues that have come up, how can we actually help people grow and heal, is how can we offer a framework that we can hang on to? Again, I was really interested in Mayor Fisher's words about this framework, right? How can we look at compassion as a framework that helps us engage, that helps us have clarity? And I'm going to share this framework that was created by Dr. Paul Gilbert. And it goes something like this. It's a three-way compassion flow framework. The first one having to do with self towards others. How can we enable ourselves to be tuned into the suffering of others, working to alleviate that suffering? Second piece, how can we help others tune into our own suffering, allowing others to get close and be reassuring towards ourselves, showing us compassion? And the third piece, how can we be compassionate towards ourselves? It all sounds so good, so why aren't we all doing it every day on a collective level? Well, the reason is these are blocks. This is far from simple. This is perhaps one of the most complicated pursuits of the human endeavor. And as we've heard from others, our species is at risk unless we're able to begin to address these blocks. Again, paying homage to this brilliant work by Dr. Gilbert, I would like to tell you about the fears of compassion. This notion that compassion can be organized in these three different directions and also blocked in these three different directions. So if we think about fears of compassion, why would I be fearful of expressing it towards others? Well, they might use me. They might take advantage of me. They might see me as weak. If I allow others to come near, are you kidding? I'm going to trust others? What if they abandon me? What if they disappoint me? These fears are legitimate. We want to find a way to help people work with these fears. I'm fearful of showing myself compassion. How on earth would I be comfortable letting go of my inner critic? How would I get anything done? You're all driven, motivated people. How are you going to accomplish anything in life unless you beat up on yourself a little bit? Come on, you can do it, right? So it's a lot of interesting research that's happened in Europe with the fears of compassion skill, showing that these are actually highly and well correlated with various measures of well-being. In other words, the more fearful you are of giving and receiving compassion, the worse off you are probably in terms of your psychological well-being. Well, we went ahead and replicated a nugget of this kind of research led by Dr. Daniel Martin. You'll hear about him in a moment. And you see the results here are very, very powerful. All of these are significant. These correlates between fearful of giving compassion to others, stress, depression, anxiety. What's really illuminating is that we kind of assume that if we're compassionate towards ourselves, or if we're fearful of showing ourselves compassion, we're going to be more depressed. And this is a lot of what our core and Western psychotherapies are focusing on. I think this here number is stunning in its importance, right? So being fearful of receiving compassion from others is almost equally potent in terms of people becoming depressed. In other words, we walk around this world, we live our lives, some of us, to an extent, all of us, with walls around us, fearful of allowing others to come close, fearful of trusting others. This is not a European or American or Israeli or Chinese or Japanese phenomena. This is a human phenomena. And we want to highlight the importance of these spheres of compassion so that we would have the opportunity to engage and address some of these fears. So some of the goals of compassionate mind training are to begin to identify these fears, blocks, resistances to compassion, learning individually, each and every one of us, what are these blocks for ourselves? And then taking action, coming up with a way to begin to address, begin to relate with our own personal fears, blocks, and resistances with compassion. So we have a little bit of a surprise for you, because the Fears of Compassion scale can be found online, but it's usually been used as a research tool. And we have found that it's a powerful tool of reflection as well. It's a powerful tool of discussion. So in a moment, we're going to ask our helpers here to actually disseminate the Fears of Compassion scale that I've just shared with you, and each of you will be receiving the Fears of Compassion scale, and there's a challenge built into it, which has to do with attention training. Receive it. Don't look at it yet. So just be tuned into what's happening up here as we describe more, but keep this for yourself for your own reflection. The invitation is for you over break, later today, carefully, thoughtfully, slowly, fill out the Fears of Compassion scale. Wonder for yourself, what items are capturing my attention? What items are a bit more elevated for me? What does that mean for me as a person? I would suggest to you that every presentation you will be hearing, receiving here today, in some way, personally for you, relates with Fears of Compassion in these three directions. So your challenge here, again, is to stay with me, and some of your neighbors might end up looking, and that's okay. You can just be compassionate towards them. That's okay. They're doing their best. So this is our little attention training exercise as we move forward with this. So how would we do this? What are our tools? What are our mechanisms towards addressing our fears of compassion, towards resilience, healing, growth? It's a technical term. So why would I use a word like good vibe here? Again, it struck a chord following the mayors of those cities, talking about how compassion is not just a personal identity kind of issue, it's also something that happens on the collective level. In the time I spent over at CCARE during my postdoc, it was very enlightening to meet some of those heroes of compassion, people that are endlessly resilient as an individual, and also they exude something more. You feel this notion of compassion, well-being, being connected with both our own resilience and then what we exude towards others. There's a little bit of a force field that happens when you come close to a person who is deeply compassionate. If I try to put it in context in our daily living of the hustle and bustle, Super Mario's invisibility stars come to mind. So really it's the idea that we can create a force field around us where we're deeply practicing compassion. Another way of speaking to it, I put it here in green, that our pursuit is that of developing a compassionate self-identity. What does it mean to recognize that we might be governed by a sad self, anxious self, angry self, and really being tuned to my identity of a compassionate person? What does that mean for each of us individually? What does it mean we're able to address our fears and concerns about being compassionate? So in terms of core training, how would we engage with people? The fundamental beginning is teaching everything that we want to know at the level that the person can process. So we would teach people psychoeducation about tricky brain, this egalitarian attitude of everything that we know we want to share with you in a way that you can digest, that our brains are not well designed. It's very hard to regulate our emotions. We become intimately familiar as we do this work with our emotional life, our emotional systems, in particular threat, drive, soothing, the capacity for nurturance. And we might teach people about the fears of compassion, this notion of compassion as flow in these three directions. We would go beyond that. CFT has an array of beautiful practices relying on contemplative framework, using method acting techniques, using Western psychology practices as well. And again, I highlight in green the compassionate self practice because I think it is core, it is central, and drawing upon many different psychotherapy traditions. So we know that CFT works in psychotherapy. There are hundreds of publications, and I'll be using the rest of my time to ask this question. Can we offer this online? Can we offer this online for broad populations that are not psychotherapy patients or clients? So I'll share with you about the Compassion Development Diet, a program developed with Dr. Daniel Martin. And essentially, we create conduits for people to engage with each other in a compassionate fashion. So people would read 3 to 5 pages every week. And the magic really happens here. People interact through video chat, finding a way to increase their resilience and compassion through dyadic interactions. And later this afternoon in the workshop, I'll show you a few of those dyadic interactions. It kind of looks like this, and I wouldn't be able to really go through it in detail, but we have different modules we can adapt for leadership like we just did, for students, for healthcare providers. All of these are very important. I want to highlight these 3. The compassionate self, tuning into what a compassionate self-identity might be about, practicing receiving, practicing self-compassion, using that as a skills menu, practicing empathy, the idea of emotional intelligence, being tuned into the experience of others and extending compassion to others. So we have this well-structured protocol that has a bit of learning to it and then a bit of interacting as well, so that people can engage with their lives in a way that's informed by the teachings of compassion. What do we get in terms of data? We ran this study with business students who are known for their compassion. This was a leadership-focused application, and you see the stats here from this first pilot is very promising. We had 94% of students, people that really didn't want to do this program, they thought it was kind of silly. 94% at the end said that they would do it again, they would recommend it to a friend. We have narrative results as well. And this is a project that we wish to pursue further and implement with more populations. Very important to share with you that we didn't use any meditation files here. So there's not 1 minute of meditation in this program, and that is on purpose, because we already know that meditation is so helpful, and we're trying to test parts in isolation so that we can learn about which would be most helpful. How can we offer up a program that scales, that reaches broad population in a way that would support the well-being of our participants the best? So, brings up the question, can we offer meditation on file? Brilliant project by Kristen McCune and Dr. Gilbert over in England. Again, working with university students, offering them different practices that they can do online, tuning in with the breath work, tuning in with the compassionate self-practice, the practice of receiving from others. Only 5 minutes per day over 2 weeks. 6-month follow-up as well. Stunning results for this pilot. You see all of these different measures shifted. At 6 months, almost all of these measures stayed elevated, meaning that by offering practices online, meditation practices, other types of imagery practices, we can actually help people increase and improve upon their well-being quite a bit. So really the task that we have at hand for ourselves at this stage is finding a way to integrate these different dimensions, thinking about scalability, thinking about how can we offer the richness, I think also the gift of these practices to as many people as possible. Can we offer these trainings in military setting, business settings, education setting? We're currently working to see how we can adapt it for these different settings. It's important to share that these are 2 examples. Personally, I've been enamored with Dr. Gilbert's work over the UK, and there's many other examples of work being done to take this beyond the scope of psychotherapy. Hundreds of publications in compassion-focused therapy are already showing us that this works pretty well in a one-on-one kind of room when we engage in the psychotherapy work. This is a bit different. This goes beyond the scope of psychotherapy. So really our endeavor, our pursuit is finding creative, useful, helpful ways to reach broader populations so that we might be able to, again, increase, augment this notion of resilience, healing, and growth through the conduit of compassion. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share with you. Thank you so much.